Many know about slavery, but few discuss paper genocide. We did not all come from Africa, and most of us have Aboriginal roots that were stripped away due to reclassification and miseducation. As a native Black American and a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation, I understand the importance of tracing your lineage. If you want to learn how to trace your genealogy and apply for tribal citizenship, go to nativeblackancestry.com to schedule a consultation.
They don't want you to remember this. You not no slave, you indigenous. Fuck how they painted them Indians. You went to war with the French and the British men. Quite frankly, you was kings, Merovingians. They took the women and men, made them prisoners, raised up the children to worship their images, set up a lab to the genes and they mixed them, and this shit get way deeper than your pigment.
Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. You know, it's real funny. It's real funny how, well, the truth always finds a way to the surface, no matter how many centuries they try to bury it. For years, Black Americans have been told that we're Africans. We've been told this by Europeans, by Plains natives, by Pan-Africans. I mean, everybody has a concerted effort to try to convince us that we are from Africa, that we were dragged here in the belly of a slave boat from the coast of West Africa. I mean, I'm not sure why, but I know you've noticed everybody seems to have a vested interest in telling us who we are. Historians as well. And when you really get into it, these folks have just been swallowed by the same colonial lies that we've been fighting to undo. Everybody wants to dictate our origin story as if we don't have our own oral traditions, our own genealogies, our own sacred memories, written in blood, bone, and earth. They mock us. They call us pretendians, wabos, lost people searching for an identity. But now, when a white historian comes forward and admits what we've been saying all along, that Black Americans are not the descendants of Africans, but the living descendants of the indigenous tribes of the Americas. Well, suddenly the room gets quiet. Suddenly, everybody who told us to trust the science, to take a DNA test, to listen to the experts, well, now they don't have anything to say. For generations, they've tried to erase us from our own homeland through paper genocide, through reclassification, through the lie of African importation. They ignored the records, the censuses, the rolls, the journals of explorers who described dark-skinned, wool-haired native people across the Southeast, the Caribbean, and beyond. They've dismissed the archaeology, the mounds, the artifacts, the art that clearly shows our image carved in stone. They've discredited the genealogy, the family records that trace back to Creek, Choctaw, Yamasee, Washita, Wale, Catawba, towns long before a slave ship ever touched these shores. And yet, here we are, standing on the same soil, bearing the same surnames, speaking the same languages, keeping the same traditions. And now, even their own scholars are confirming it. That's the part that stings, because when we say it's a conspiracy, when we say that we're indigenous to this land, it's cue the X-Files themes. I mean, it's a vast conspiracy. But when a white man says it, it's groundbreaking research. And we have to tip our hats to the allies in the struggle, because now that we have members of their own community speaking truth to power, I mean, what excuse will they make? What excuse will they have now that one of their own echoes the same truth that we've carried for centuries? Will they finally admit that maybe, just maybe, the so-called African American is the reclassified Indian of the Americas? Or will they twist themselves into more academic gymnastics, trying to explain away what's right in front of their eyes? See, this isn't about validation. We don't need anybody to confirm who we are. We've always known. But when we hear members of our apparent opposition echoing the same sentiment, I mean, damn it if that isn't speaking truth to power. Damn it if that isn't proof of how powerful the movement has become. So powerful that even folks on the outside can no longer deny it. So tonight, Tonight, I want every Native Black American listening to remember this. We're not lost. We're not confused. We're not having an identity crisis. We're not pretending we are the original people of this land, the mound builders, the farmers, the warriors, the ones who survived reclassification. Our ancestors' bones are the foundation of this continent, and no amount of denial can change that. They try to write us out of history, but now even their own historians are writing us back in. So welcome to the age of revelation. The truth is no longer hidden, and it's coming straight from their own mouths. Now, smash the like button on the way in. Subscribe to the channel if you're new. Check out the website, nativeblack.ancestry.com. I built it out with tons of historical resources, and you can always connect with me one-on-one through the website if you need assistance with genealogy. I've also just launched the Hidden Heritage course. That is 2 years in the making. Right now, I'm running a 50% promo until the first of the month. So again, check that out. But guys, we've got to touch on who our honored guest is. You see, I came across him maybe 3 months ago. He was on another channel. I think it was called the Autochthon Network or Aboriginal. I'm not sure exactly, but I came across his information, and he was speaking to something that most of us are unaware of, and that's really the blueprint, the formulaic blueprint that European colonizers use when it comes to taking over our land. You see, most of us here in history schools that, the Europeans came as pilgrims, as meek settlers, and unbeknownst to them, they brought some diseases, and most of the Indians died, and then, they got pushed to Oklahoma into this discussion, right? But you see, there was actually centuries leading up to Indian removal, 1830s. And this guy, this man, he has a YouTube channel as well as a TikTok. He goes by Handsome History, and he's the only one that I've seen break down in detail the formulaic plan of imperial colonization, really from like 1500s all the way up to Reconstruction. That's the part that I'm not really an expert on, guys. I'm going to be frank. As an American Indian myself, I know a lot about the history. Especially when it comes to post-Reconstruction, racial reclassification, Jim Crow, segregation, redlining, all that. But when we talk about groups like the Lords Proprietors, when we talk about different Christian denominations who seem to come over here bearing the cross in friendship, well, in actuality, we'll learn tonight that these different forms of religion were really tools of subjugation. But before I bring up our honored guest, I think it's only right for me to get you acquainted with some of his content. So again, you can check him out on YouTube, Handsome History. He's also on TikTok under the same name. And let me just play one of his videos so that you guys can get a good little intro into what he discusses. Here we go.
These were descendants of Aboriginal Indians that had been in the Americas. Most of the slaves were descendants of Aboriginal Indians that had been in the Americas for probably 10,000 years or more. The 1892 World's Fair in Chicago has a white tea European scientist claiming this exact theory. First of all, the scientist, Mr. Smith, spent a year in Colorado and inside what we now call the Grand Canyon. He excavated. He brought mummies to the fair, and I quote, "They were better maintained and preserved than the mummies in Egypt," unquote. Then he goes into the point that all the scientists today recognize that the inhabitants of these dwellings predated the historic man and that their descendants were still with us. This is a European scientist, now in America, 1892. These facts established, let's take a look at what earlier writers who had traveled to America, usually as missionaries, wrote about their experiences with the Aboriginal Indians. So you might ask, well, what happened to them? Well, first of all, many of them, millions of them are still here, and they've been reclassified as Negroes and African Americans who were brought over in the slave trade from Africa. Let's take a look at this book written in 1791. This was a missionary involved with more northern Mississippian Indians, would have been up against the Great Lakes. And he discusses how early on, like way back, 1400s, 1500s, the intermarriage begins between Europeans who, most of them were dark-skinned, or many of them were Moors, but they began to intermarry with the Indians. And then what it says is, like, when the English would defeat the French in their wars, they would enslave the Indians that were fighting on the side of the French. Now, what did that mean? Here's what you need to understand. When the English would beat the French, or the French would beat the English, they were both using Aboriginal Indians as the muscle, as the fighters. So if the English beat the French, they would simply they wouldn't take them anywhere. They would just enslave the Aboriginals in place, in the villages that they already lived in the towns they already built, and on the farmland that they were already producing on for thousands of years. They wouldn't move them anywhere. This 1791 writer goes on to say that at that point in the 1790s, he makes the case that most of your Indians in America are actually mixed European. Now, I think he's way off there. He's talking about your elite, and that's where you have the formation of these Native American tribes, or the takeover of Aboriginal tribes by these mixed Native American elite. Very, very critical to always distinguish between the elite and the masses. Important to emphasize that this was what I call enslavement in place. In other words, your town, your region of a tribe lost battles, and you just started working for the winners. You did the same work, only now you had to provide 10 or 20% of the agricultural production to them, to the so-called masters. And believe me, this was a very normal practice for thousands of years. So, with this understanding, what was going on in the southeastern United States at the time of the Civil War makes a lot more sense. They simply renamed them and relabeled them as Negroes, and then African Americans and blacks, as the new regime took over. Most of that relabeling occurs after the Civil War. It's a takeover after the Civil War. And this is the social and economic system that Americans live with today. Handsome history out. Most of the slaves were...
All right, so hopefully that gives you a nice little introduction into the type of hidden history that he expounds upon. I mean, I'm pretty well researched, but I think he's the first one that I heard use the term enslavement in place. Makes perfect sense, right? Why import people from the other side of the world and teach them how to farm crops indigenous to the Americas, when you can take local indigenous communities that you're displacing and beating in armed conflicts and have them lend their agricultural know-how to you and your corporation. Yeah, reclassification, that's right. But guys, again, make sure to check him out. Handsome History on YouTube as well as on TikTok. And without further ado, here's the man of the hour. How you doing?
Hey, Michael. Well, that's a lot of pressure. Yeah.
No pressure, no pressure.
For me, I just come at it just a little on myself. I got into this seriously a couple years ago. Actually, I was listening to, various people really from the indigenous community that would be maybe reading old books the first, I'm a big historian. I got, went to college, got master's degrees. I know how to do research is my point, but I never did it on this topic. So I know how to be methodical and like tell a story in an academic sense. So I want to just start looking into this myself, because I've always loved American history, so to speak. And I didn't, listen to these other guys, and kind of made me, as I was reading, question what I was reading, and then start to dig deeper, go, man, I don't think these guys are joking. Like, all right, wait a second. Like, I'm finding my own sources. I'm looking in legislation from the South. I'm looking in legislation from colonial New England. You find slavery legislation in Europe, and I'm like, wow, wait, there's a whole system of this. There's a whole bunch of laws of this. There's actually you start going, wow, like, wait a second, like this is a whole different maybe story than like we're told. So that's sort of how it started, actually listening to, just because I enjoy history, and I was like, man, these guys are talking about maybe America being the old world, and now I totally am down with that. I'm like, this totally makes sense. I got the whole, I'm like, I get it now. But it's like funny at first. It's like, okay,
I guess with for a guy like me, it's not so much. And I'm sure a lot of it's indoctrination, but it's also just like, when you're making a claim that goes against like the supposed, convention and everybody's research that already supposedly, right? Like we all assume, right, that the scientist or the historian, right, that we can trust them, right? And so when somebody then, right, comes out with a theory that's upending the old theory, you just kind of like, well, you better come with some evidence, right? That's just human nature. Like if you're saying, I mean, obviously what we're talking about here is the irony is that, the revision already happened, right? The revision, right, in the unscientific part is what I consider what happens after the Civil War. And, with all this especially. Yeah, so once I sort of got into that and I was like, hey, this is what you're supposed to do. Look to, sort of nullify hypotheses, right? Like if you really want to get into something and it's like, okay, I'm starting to see some things that look like, the story we've been told about slavery isn't what it is. And then that starts to lead into the, where do they come from? I start doing the numbers and I'm like, at some point, even the convention now is down to less than 400,000 Africans brought over. And I'm like, well, that's over a 200-year period. So that's not even like 200 Africans a year. And if they were getting so mistreated on the way, probably only 3/4 of them survive. I start doing some math and I'm like, play around with AI. And there's like no way to get from that to 4 million slaves and free people of color at the time of the Civil War. Like it doesn't, there's no way. It doesn't make any sense. It would have been like 5 times faster reproduction rate, and these are the guys supposedly being famished and beaten, So it's like the whole story stops just like not making sense. Like you keep looking at another part of it and you're like, oh, okay, that's actually not what happened. That went from everything I found, judicial reviews. I mean, so then so I'm like, well, are there laws about, oh, what do you know? Slaves had standing in court.
Black people are online saying that they're indigenous and there's laws on the books to reclassify indigenous people as black and Negro and colored.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's just a lot like where you're just, and then, so the funny thing is what I've come to realize is, a lot of it's written down. It's actually not hidden. It's just that the history profession, and that's a whole story. But in terms of like the, legislation, corporate sources, even you get into stuff the church missionaries are willing, they were documenting everything. These are all, corporations. I just want to put that to like, everything's a corporation. Okay. It's a form of a corporation, the church, the Anti-Slavery Society, the colonial company, each of our state governments, they're trust corporations, and they're all in some form or fashion, like trying to, make money or grow wealth and all that. Maybe not particularly the church, but the church has the same guys on its board that are also on the board at the local bank, and they're fun. You know what I mean? Like there's, you see what I'm saying? So that's also a big thing that I discovered. Is like, man, you got to stop talking about nations and you got to stop talking about religions per se and races and all that at this point. Because what these cats do is they just incorporate everything. Everything's an incorporation. And that's just something I like to put out there too as I was getting through this. But yeah, that's kind of how I got to it. That's kind of where I come from on it. And like I said, I wasn't even really looking in this topic. It was really studying. I really started out to focus on the Lord proprietors. Yeah, that was actually the start. So.
Okay. Well, so you come from an academic background. You have a master's. I'm sure your master's is probably not in American Indian history or anything, but no. You're doing your own independent research on the Lord's proprietors, and that kind of leads you into learning about the rest of colonialism and American Indian history. For those watching right now that have never heard of the Lord's proprietors, who would you say these folks are, and why are they so important?
Okay, so I'll just tell you to get you interested in them is they're knights. Okay, these still have the knightly orders at this time, and they might have not. They're not the Templars anymore, but they're now the stockholders in the rulers of these corporations, and they literally call each other knights still in their corporate, their memorandums and stuff. And they actually come to Virginia and Plymouth in armor. They always talk about the conquistadors. If you grow up in America, they never tell you about the armored knights showing up with dogs of war as well in America. And they did it, the whole thing. They're all doing it. Okay. So that's the first thing that it's just like, man, you got these guys, the Lord proprietors, and that's who they really are. I would also say they are kingmakers. Okay. So one that I really love to follow is the Descartes family and the Cravens. They're both big in the South, North and South Carolina. The Carterets go back to the 1200s, Templar locations in Normandy, but they're kingmakers. They're the guys that protected and restored Prince Charles, who became King Charles II in the English Civil War. So he's a protector of the House of Stuart on the island of Jersey. He protects
Quick
him
question.
against all that invasion by the Protestants. That's how powerful, and his reward is all this stuff, all this land in the Americas, just to tie it down. So,
I see.
Yeah.
When you said the Cartier family?
yeah, Descartes, yep, or Cartier.
Okay. Does that have any relation to the modern brand Cartier?
Yeah, so those are the type
no?
of things I'm looking into. I don't have a specific one to that, but I have them involved in. We have one that was the CEO of an investment bank in the 90s. Another was a admiral in Normandy and also in Hong Kong when China opened up. We got they still are in the Isle of Jersey in the English Channel. They actually manage like a ton of money. Like they're basically an offshore island, and this family's been there for 800 years now, or whatever, on the record. Yeah, they're still going strong, and yeah, they're legit. You can see their family names in different companies right now.
Yeah. And the reason I asked that question is because in my research, I found that certain families, like the Hilton family, they're actually rooted in colonialism and displacing indigenous populations. But nowadays, it's just a hotel brand, right?
Right. Well, so you mentioned hotels. So hotels comes from like hosting, which actually comes from hosting elites. So the elites, after part of treaties, right? And this isn't just colony in America, this is worldwide. They would host each other's like valuable people, family members, right? That's hostaging, right? That is also with the Templars. Their temples were also hotels. So they're the original bankers, and they have hotels. And of course, you got to wonder why we have Hyatt and Hilton. That's two of the big H's, right? And even in that industry, yeah, I haven't researched that, but it wouldn't surprise me. Okay. So anyhow, you understand hosting hotel. Well, here in America, one of the major ways they converted and added to the settler class and created more not Indian, but English citizens is through hostaging. And straight up, beginning as early as 1620 in Virginia, around the same. I mean, every one of your early books that they even write by their own churches would write. They're telling you this is what they were doing. So it's not like this is hidden by the people that did it weren't hiding what they did. Like after the Civil War. Yeah,
let's slow down for a moment.
Yeah.
Let's slow down for just a moment because you mentioned hostaging.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, for a lot of the people watching this right now, for a lot of people who are going to be watching the replay, that word doesn't strike as much as a resonance as it should. Can we dive deeper into hostaging? Because like how in Europe,
it's important to distinguish. Yeah. So this is another problem with American history is that every black person is a slave. Like, if you're in a bad situation, you're a slave, right? They just call everybody a slave. And no, this stuff really meant something. So, to be a hostage, there was laws around hostage, and it typically applied to the elite. So what would happen? I'll give you just in Virginia. Early on, it starts that they're sitting around already. So they would raid a village. The way it begins is they raid the village, steal some kids. That's the beginning of it. By the time I get to, I think it's about 1620 in Virginia. So they've been there about 15 years. They keep pushing, right? These guys are persistent. They keep coming back. They're having conversations about putting up money to pay for reverends and to pay Chief Powhatan for the 11,000 acre university they're going to take over to host all these Indian children. So by that time already, they've so much converted, negotiated, intimidated. Just all of this is going on that they're literally talking about hundreds at that point of the elite's children aged 2 to 7 going through this hostaging, what they'll call the apprentice system. And they pop out at age 21 with all the rights of Englishmen as long as they're in the Americas. And so they're putting them on the books as an Englishman.
And when we talk about Chief Powhatan, I believe that's the father of Pocahontas.
Yes.
And Pocahontas was taken as a hostage, eventually passes in Europe, right?
Right. There's a lot of myth about it, but even in the myth and literature, they're telling you a lot of truth in it. Her story is just kind of, she supposedly, daddy, don't kill him or whatever. I think that's like whatever. But what's really interesting is they do send people. Yes, they do hostage him, and there's a great part in the story in the poem, so to speak. It's not her, it's another. It's actually Powhatan's son. I think his name was Nimontac, and he did go over there, and they literally take him up into the Tower of London. You go, guys, the tower where they're going to chop your head off the next day. You see what they were doing to these kids? So they're taking him up there. And so, and he's describing the poem like he peered around, and Powhatan said, "Hey, I sent you with, you're supposed to notch the sticks." Which now I realize those are Roman numerals. So you see, everything's hijacked. I'm like, wait, Roman numerals?
Oh, hold on.
Yeah, I'm like,
let me attempt to simplify this and connect the dots for those who are struggling to follow along.
Oh, sorry.
So when we talk about hostaging, a lot of people know hostaging as kidnapping someone, holding them for ransom.
Oh, well, right.
They absolutely did that in early days of colonialism. For example, De Soto, when he's going all throughout the Southeast, he would take his mercenaries, which were basically like some SEAL Team 6 type motherfuckers, and they would come in as if they were friendly with the tribe or something, and they would quickly take the chief and put him in chains and hold a knife to his head and say, "Look, you're going to be our hostage, and you're going to safely get us to the next territory. You'll be our translator. You'll be our guide." And you're saying that perhaps the Europeans modeled that playbook to a degree, but the Europeans do it differently, because the Europeans, I find, don't just take your daughter, take your son in exchange for corn and things of that nature, but they seem to have a conversion hostaging system where we're going to take your child, Christianize them, turn them into a nice little white English settler on the inside, and then bring them back amongst your tribe to convert the rest of your community.
I mean, it's hard to believe, but as once you start to look for it, there's way more sources that really tell you that. But if you haven't been taught that framework, you'll read it and not get it. You know what I mean? So like what I mean by that is somebody maybe living in 1850 reading the same book will totally get it, but we don't get it because of, you know what I'm saying? Like, we have been really indoctrinated and told a whole whatever story that hadn't happened yet. So once you kind of can key in, I mean, you just said it. So that's what goes on, guys. And it's literally, they're doing two things. They're now labeled that. So here's the first relabel. They're getting labeled now as an English citizen. And guess what? They didn't get redeployed. They become the missionaries. They become the Bureau of Indian Affairs guys. They become anybody basically. Your traders, your fur traders. So this whole thing is like, they try to make it sound like dudes from Europe came over and a whole bunch of them really learned how to do all that stuff. And like, that's not how it works, man. This stuff is complicated. So even the way they tell that, this guy was French. Now you got to even question a lot of that. What we'll call a guy French who was born Indian, got hostage at 2 or 3, came through the Catholic Jesuit system, pops out, and he's now labeled a French colonist. And now when they're writing about him, they'll call him by his new name, and they'll call him French. You can catch them in lies sometimes because they might mention he was an Indian, or they'll describe him as having, the Hawkeye look or copper color. And that's where they're cluing you in that this is a hostage, converted, turned Indian. And once you start to key in on it, you start seeing it everywhere. You see it in the military. You see it I see it in George Washington. I see it in William Tecumseh Sherman. And you can track like these, they always get assigned to very powerful people so they can get groomed. And I don't mean it like in the weird way it's become, but like, they're getting the best tutors. They're it's in Europe, they call it the ministerialis. That was the golden chains of like elite slavery, or what hostaging. And just to tie it to one more thing, and I'll get off of this subject, but a lot of us have seen that picture. It's like King George the First, I think it is. And he has these 2 dark-skinned men behind him. And it's always been, oh, who are those guys? These Turks. And it's like, they're elite Ottomans. They had fought the Ottomans for the Austrians. And those were simply a picture of exactly what we're talking about. So they didn't come over here and like, we're going to do this special for the American Indian. They came over here and they already had a process. It's also a process they practice within Europe. When you read about them going against pagans, ask yourself who the pagans really were. They have a lot of similar economic systems to the indigenous American Indian system. So what was really going on there? And, they converted them in the same way, just like Mike was saying. These are the knights. You see what I mean? The knights, this is the knight's tactic. You know, they are special operators. They do this hostaging. They get a little hook and right. They give and take, right? You know, yeah, this is what they've been doing. This is their process.
You know what? This reminds me of something. Someone asked me the question the other day. They were like, "Well, Mike, like, how did the Europeans take over our entire continent if we outnumber them so greatly?" And I try to explain to this person that you're thinking of it wrong. You're thinking as if they sent a military force to the shores of our army, and then we outnumbered them significantly, and we went to equal armed combat, and somehow they still got the upper hand.
Right?
Absolutely not. They came over here on some ancient CIA type stuff to where, as he was saying, they would take hundreds or even thousands of indigenous people from the East Coast, the Southeast, send them to Europe, convert them, Christianize them, Europeanize them, and then they put them in their communities as agent provocateurs. And through these agents, they have control of the tribe. Just like a lot of Black Americans will understand the reference if we talk about the Boule. When we talk about the Boule and all these folks who have part European, part American Indian heritage, but they're on code with the Europeans, naming all their institutions African this, African that, trying to name you as an African American. Why do they do that? Because these are the people that descend from hostage bloodlines.
Man, right on.
Let's get into it.
And all this starts to fit, right? So then it's like, okay, so that's how they're handling the elite. And then the working middle class guys, the operators, right? Your engineers, right? That they're enslaved in place. And now we also know they get moved around within the Americas. We know there's a slave trade, an internal one. But ideally, let's think about it. These are corporations taking over. Like, their low cost way of doing this is just keep doing what you're doing, man. And just send us more of the product. Like, you know what I'm saying? That's what they're after, right? And that's literally comes through in the books, especially about the Virginia colony. I mean, these Europeans don't know nothing about farming. They're not even trying. So then that's their behavior for at least 40 years, the first 40 years up and down the East Coast. So the question becomes, well, who was providing them the food? Okay, were they going over? You see, then all of a sudden,
Europeans are coming here trying to establish colonies. They don't know how to cultivate. They don't know how to grow the simplest of things, such as corn. So they rely on the indigenous communities, do bad business with the indigenous communities, and that's what leads to destruction of certain colonies like Roanoke, right?
Yeah, right. So you see the fights, but they quell. So we talked hostage and we talked slavery. Let's talk assassination. So you get in detail on the Powhatans. You got to get going around 1610. It's 1623 though. The Powhatans like decimate the Jamestown colony. By decimate, I mean they take them down. Just to show you guys how small potatoes this all is. From 1600 to 1200 colonists. So as of like 1623, after almost 20 years there, they've managed to get about 1,200 Europeans there doing whatever the heck they're doing, guys. So that brings back the question, well, how in the heck is this still going on? How are they staying in the ball game, right? Well, it's also called assassinations. So I'm reading this book, and it's like the corporate charters, the corporate notes between each other. And it's literally, note this, it's August 23rd, 1623. It's assassination night. And you got guys like the ancestor of James Madison involved. You got other big names, and they're all, like we just said, these are knights, these are special operators, and it literally lists Madison's knocking off this tribal leader, Jones is nailing this guy. They go out, they do their thing, they go back out, they get like 3 more. They kill 12 chiefs like in that time. They go on and nail a few more like a year later. So you got to understand, like, that's what starts to happen. They start decapitating what they call, you got to kill off the elites and the ancients and the priests. The Puritans knew how to do that. There's this famous speech. They're sending Lord of War, Lord Delaware. So Delaware is actually Normandy, de la War. They literally send a guy whose position title is the Lord of War to come to the Virginia colony in 1610 and start laying down the law in Virginia, as he already did up north. And in this speech, the guy's basically, he's laying it out, guys. He basically says, we're going to go over there and enslave them in their own fields. He's just saying like the game plan. And then he says it like this. He goes, we're going to show them the fear of the Lord. So we're going to introduce them to this new God spell, and he even calls it a ghost spell, and he spells it with 2 L's. So back then it was still like spelled. Literally, they're calling it the God spell in the Puritan language. Okay.
And that's who the state of Delaware is essentially named after, right?
It's absolutely named after. He had already been up there like 5 years earlier and knocked some heads, and like, oh yeah. So he's a big time like Lord Proprietor type guy. He's ancient. He's got to be like he's from Normandy, like Carter.
And for anybody who wants a more allegorical take on individuals like the Lord's Proprietor, a good fictional example I like to give people is watch the new Dune movies. That's basically the blueprint of American Indian colonialism. Frank Herbert, the writer, was actually inspired by colonialism in certain aspects. So when you see a Duke of Arrakis coming over here to be a steward over an indigenous people in a foreign land to extract the resources for the empire and guys, this is a similar blueprint.
Yes, it's like right. So it is they've done it before, right? So it's like so they do this. So basically, they got assassinated. So I just want to put that out there that people realize like it's like targeted violence, very targeted, like effective violence, high payoff violence combined with this hostaging, right? And then at the same time, yeah, you got the missionary going, well, let me help you make a best of a bad situation, boss. Like they've traded horrible options, right? And the missionary is the better option maybe because he's like, hey man, if you guys convert, we'll take it easier on you, right? We can work out a deal. We'll protect, all this. This is how it starts.
Let's put that in more simple terms.
Okay.
The knights in shining armor and the religious faction combine to play good cop, bad cop. First, you come through butchering people, putting heads on spikes. Then we come through and say, look, we're doing this because your God is really the devil, and there's a new gospel and there's a new way of doing things. And if you come and convert to our Christianity, then we can save you from this evil guy's killing you and raping your woman. So now you get the different tactics being played, right?
Yeah. And that's the psyop, right? So, they're like I said, like you got to ask, like they never sent 100 ships over thousands of men, right? So you got to ask yourself, like, how does 600 men? It just shows how valuable it was to take out the elites. Like obviously in the indigenous civilization, right? There was more like, obviously just like they studied you, like they knew, like, hey, everybody, there's just more influence or whatever. So there has to be something that happens over time between the hostaging, like. People are being promoted where they don't have the experience. You know what I mean? Just think about it a little bit, like 20, 30 years of all this upending and discombobulation. And okay, I'll convert. Like, what the hell just happened? Like, it started so small, right? Like, how did it go from this to that? Like, in like 40 years, by 1650, they're in what's the little Williamsburg. Okay, I'm going to do a deep dive video on this. This is the first treaty with the power. It's bad, and but it writes it all out, guys. It says you guys are now to stay on this big reservation and pay us tribute. Now, then you got to ask yourself, well, that means they didn't all go on this line. So already you have Indians that didn't go within the reservation. So that means the Indians that stayed are either going to be slaves or, guys, they're actually English citizens because they went through that system of hostaging we talked about. You got a whole thing going on here, like
and it's interesting you mentioned Williamsburg. I'm not sure if this is the same Williamsburg, but on my website nativeblack.ancestry.com, I've curated a digital archive with over 600 documents, and in one of these sections I've got fugitive Indian slave ads, and one of these slave ads is from Williamsburg. Actually, Prince Williams, June 1st, 1776, $10 reward. Run away from the subscriber on his journey from Williamsburg on the 11th of May near King William County, a mulatto servant man named John Newton, about 20 years of age, an Indian by birth.
There you go. 21. So he's finished his apprenticeship. It looks like he might have left like a year early. What age you can see what's going on there, right? That's it. I mean,
first they classify him as a mulatto, and then later you learn, oh no, that's an Indian.
But we're also realizing mulatto means he's also an Englishman. Like he's gonna become an Englishman once he finishes that apprenticeship. That's how much they're gonna bury the Indian in him. Like he's not like, so his kids aren't even thinking like, I'm an Englishman. Everybody, I got the rights of an Englishman. They took me away from that whole society. That hostage, they took them away.
That's probably how we have individuals like Crispus Attucks, famous Black indigenous man, first martyr of the Boston Massacre. Well, how is he a free indigenous man sailing and stuff? He had to have come through that hostaging system, right?
Yeah. And it also explains he's not from Africa. Like to have all these skills here in the Americas to wheel and deal, negotiate, raise military support for you. What do you mean how is that? Show me that. So almost all these so-called slavery votes now make a lot more sense if you agree with, hey, these are just the locals enslaved in place. Well, the locals know their way around. They know how to communicate. They got an intelligence network. All of a sudden, okay, this makes sense that they could do some of this complicated revolt stuff that goes on.
Oh wait, hold on. But the indigenous people that are too warlike, that are too rebellious, they don't get enslaved in place. Their women and children do, but the warriors get shipped to the Caribbean to a different colony, or shipped to South America, or shipped to Central America, right?
Right. But here's the other one we're not thinking of. Then there's the indigenous who don't go off the program and just keep moving west. So when I'm reading about Tecumseh, one of his main chiefs is a third generation Delaware Lenape. Okay, he kept moving. So here's what gets really wild at this point. Now you kind of know what what are the four sources of indigenous American Indians? Well, there's 4 or 5 categories at this point, but it's important to know what they are because it helps you interpret like any story that you're reading.
And real quick, for anybody who's not familiar with Tecumseh, correct me if I'm wrong, but guys, you should look him up. He tried to lead a pan-indigenous movement against European settlement and expansion, and now it makes sense to me why he was so open to a pan-indigenous movement, because there were so many indigenous people displaced from other areas, and they've got to form this coalition to give a last stand.
Okay, yeah, and that's okay. I'm gonna circle right back to that because this leads to Tecumseh's time. There's actually a statement made by one of his Chief Blackhawk that gets to what we're talking about. But I'm gonna take you back east earlier. You have these things, we talked about conversion, all that. Guys, we're talking mass conversion. In New England, they call them the praying villages. What does that imply? That implied entire Indian villages had converted, and then that included clearing the land. So to become good English Christians, right? There's things you do. That's the fencing. That's everything in the squares. That's monoculture. That's what they had to do to become truly English and come under the so-called protection of the English. I know it's wild. Like, wait, why are they putting themselves in? That just gets into like, the psychological aspect. I think obviously the duress, but I just think they were a decimated people. I think a lot had gone on way before 1492, and we're looking at people that are worn down. I think there's a lot more to it, right? So here come these guys, right, who are knights.
What I think may be the missing link in my research, what I think is the missing link is first and foremost, I've learned that the Spanish way more forthright. The Spanish are way more open and honest about Black indigenous communities, about the architecture, about how vast their culture and civilization were. The Spanish are massacring people, stealing the gold, sending it to Spain. They didn't really see a reason to lie and hide the fact of all these Black. They literally call us negros de terras, right? Blacks of this land. And they would call the African slaves they brought over negros de Guinea, Blacks of Africa. They knew who was who and was which. But this is something that a lot of people got to understand. While the Spanish are so open and so honest, I mean, the other European factions that would come 100 years later, they're the opposite. Mm-hmm. Why are they the opposite? Because at a certain point in time, they realize they want to stay for good. They don't want to just do a trading post or a little colony. They want to stay and make this New England, New Amsterdam, so on and so forth. And if these folks are rebelling and resisting, then how do we prevent future conflict? Well, not just enslaving them, not just reclassifying them, but we have to re-educate them. We have to outlaw them reading and them writing, and then through generations we can convince them, matter of fact, you come from Africa, so why don't we send you back to Africa? Wink, wink.
Oh, I mean, right. So the education, the indoctrination is real. And again, it starts early, right? So if you already have, after 40, 60 years, a whole generations of elite Indians like bought into the system, they're actually the new missionaries going west, converting the other Indian village, don't you see? And then the colonists that do come over, of course, they're marrying all the women they can to get access to the property title. So that's what's really going on. All your elite Europeans aren't bringing European women over.
Hold on. To touch on that for a moment, because that's a big difference that I see between the Spanish and the other Europeans that would come later. The Spanish are mostly into extracting the riches, right? Whereas I see, especially the Scottish Highlanders, since the 1500s, they're coming into the Southeast and interbreeding with indigenous tribes to get in position of power and favorable trade terms. And you guys can actually look this up. Every single one of the 5 civilized tribes that had an Indian chief that signed away the tribe's land, that resulted in the tribe walking the Trail of Tears, every single one was a half-breed with a Scottish father and an indigenous mother.
Well, Yeah, and I just want to say it's actually way more system. It's like everybody was doing. That's what I'm telling you. George Washington, I guarantee you, he's mixed blood. All those guys that are founders, like the question becomes like, well, who did their granddad mate with over here? Because there's no record. They weren't bringing over. Number one, you got to remember they work for these big corporations. You know, it makes them valuable marrying an Indian elite woman to get property. So that was part of their requirement. Okay, so once you kind of
I
understand
tell people all the time.
this, yeah, yeah, it's huge.
Real quick, I tell people all the time. I have some genealogy clients, and we do find that they have ancestors that were enslaved. And I explain to them all the time: just because they're enslaved does not mean they came from Africa. What vested interests would a plantation owner have with having a baby with an African slave?
Right.
Zero, zilch,
right.
nada.
Right.
The best thing someone will say to me is, well, they'll have a baby with them so that's like another worker. Well, that's a long-term investment. You got to wait till they're 16 or 17. That makes zero sense. But now if we put the shoe on the other foot and we say, what benefit does a plantation owner have having a baby with a local indigenous woman? Well, now maybe she can convince her local tribe to come live and work on his plantation. Now their child can be used as a half-breed agent provocateur to sign treaties.
Yeah. Right. So at some point it must become almost overwhelming. Like everybody's wheeling and dealing. So I just want to bring one guy because man, by 1760, I've been reading this book where it's literally Indian horse traders. They're just chiefs, and this guy's a European from the House of Hanover, and they're like, they're really negotiating the contracts, and it's like everybody knows the language, everybody knows finance, everybody knows what's going on. This is by like 1760 in the Southeast. So already by then, the changeover, all those generations of conversions and this hostaging and it had its effect. It had its effect. Even if you had continued to go west, if you wanted to do business and trade, well, you're going to trade with your old Indian converted buddy. And I just want to say something on that. I figured out that that's the origin of the real term Yankee. Yankee is Algonquin Yankee. Yankee was foreigner, right? It just so happens that all the foreigners that were coming over from England. So people go, oh, it means no, it means foreigner. So guess what? Every Indian that converts, every Indian village, they start calling them Yangeese villages, Yankees. So who are the Yankees? When you are at 1776, the Yankees are the descendants of the mixed and not even mixed, just convert. If you convert, there's no need to mix. There's not enough Europeans to even mix with in all this time. Think about it. We're just talking converted white Englishmen on the books as Englishmen and good Christians since 1640, and we're at 1770, 130 years later, and you're telling me that's not who's throwing the tea in the harbor, and they look like Indians.
At one point in time, I thought it was a psyops. I thought that they were dressing as Indians during the Boston Tea Party to put the blame on the Indians and create division between the British and the Indians. But when you do the research, you find that there were already generations of hostage Indians intermixed with Europeans, that by the time you get a few generations of this, they're kind of indistinguishable from a European.
Right. So everything we're saying, see, all these puzzle pieces fit a lot better now, right? Yeah, I mean, now how about who are the free people of color? Are they entrepreneurial African slaves from the jungle who came over here with capital? Or are they operator experts at whatever here in the Americas who got a land deal, playing the capitalist game and are doing their thing? And how come the free states don't want to let them in? Do they not want to let them in because they're poor and stupid and low-priced labor? Or do they not want to let them in because they'll fucking take over? Everything makes more sense when you accept that it's mostly indigenous that were enslaved in place, add in the conversion, and it's just, the whole story's horrible, but it happened, you got to put it, this is decades in the making, but it works. And you got, by 1700, you got grandsons of, and they're Englishmen in Virginia. They're English, who is Robert E. Lee really? Who is Light Horse Harry Lee really? They're Indians.
And see, I tell people all the time, I'm glad you brought up the free people of color.
There's nobody else around.
I'm really glad that you brought up the free people of color phenomenon, because in my research as a genealogist, I find in the 1600s, the 1700s, we've got census records with so many free people of color listed. And I tell my audience all the time, if we're supposed to believe that all Black people come from West Africa, what cruise ship was bringing free Africans over here?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
What cruise ship was bringing free Africans to come over here and live in the U.S. and get businesses and all this? Why? Wait, hold on. Let's take it deeper. Let's segue into what was really going on during Confederate slavery, because when folks start connecting the dots on the Freedmen's Bureau, the Freedmen Bank, you have to ask yourself, if these folks are working for free, how do they have so much land and so much money that they need their own bank for the U.S. government to siphon their funds?
What? Right. Why do they need a bank? Right. Like that, and that's my approach to all these guys, by the way. Like, I don't try to be academic, because that's like a con game to play by those rules. So I play by like a set of rules as if I'm in like maybe a civil court case, and I gotta prosecute you. And if I can prove it would beyond a good high probability. That's like this. O.J. Simpson won his criminal case, but he lost his civil case. There's a lower proof. Yep. So my point being, don't sit here and tell me I got to go find 100 sources to prove this. They need to find 100 sources showing us all the slaves they brought over, and then I'll go find 100 sources to prove what I'm talking about. You get what I'm saying? So we're talking about being like an investigator, looking at the blood splatter, looking at the crime scene, and let's use some logic and experience, and let's put this together and say this is the most likely explanation of what was going on 90% of the time. I'm not saying there were no African slaves, but
real quick, I see a comment on TikTok. Someone says, "Where's the Black Canadian tribes at?" Well, you have to stop and think about this. Well, if melanated Black, for lack of better terms, if Black people are the indigenous tribes of the Americas originally, and we have the lay of the land, why would we want to live in frigid ass Alaska or Canada? Wouldn't we want to live in the prime real estate, the lush rainforest, the canopies, the southeast? I mean, why would we, the Asians that they say migrated across the Bering Strait? Those folks set up shop in the land that we allow them to. The south western plains, the Nevada desert, Utah desert, New Mexico, Alaska, Canada. That's where they're allowed to roam. And when they encroached on our land, we had armed conflicts. They're even depicted in pyramids on hieroglyphs across the Americas. Yep. So you got to understand why these folks have such vitriol for us to this day. They remember our ancestors putting foot to ass, and I'm not talking about the recent ones that were Buffalo Soldiers forcing them to the reservations.
Right. Yeah. Right. I mean, there's a whole. Okay, so you want me to go after the freedmen now first, or?
Oh yeah. Okay,
go for it. Yeah, because here's another puzzle piece. So the Freedmen's Bank and all that. Let's remember they set this up after the war. Now the first thing is like, well, who are all these ex-Black slaves, right, who have property titles that the Freedmen's Bank wants, have all this cash? This is what's going on. So that's the first thing that makes you go hum about slavery and the nature of it, right? But here's the thing. It's a total bait and switch. So they basically want to set up a bank to get them to provide all this information. They didn't have this information on who owned what were the boundaries of the different lands, right? This is all the type of archives that I'm sure still exist.
So we saved them time and effort because they didn't have to survey the land. We surveyed it for them by giving them our titles and deeds.
Right. And now they know who to go after, right? So now it's after the war, right? And so that's the first thing that's going on. And then they start the whole, they start the whole thing of basically using those deposits and loaning them to like the railroad companies and all this stock. And they make a bunch of money but then like two of them go bankrupt and they don't pay back the bank. And then the bank just literally like closes its doors like the next day, like they physically close the doors. And then they have a bunch of fires at all the banks. This is like in the conventional history, they admit all this. And like all those titles that the African slave somehow grinded out. Doesn't it all make more sense now that the indigenous enslaved, right? Put those titles in there, they got burned. This is the official story, okay? So there's a total strategic play. What was that war about? It was about going after the last remaining indigenous in place, lodged in there, running a different type of economy. Remember the Civil War, prior to the Civil War, 5 Southern banks stiff-armed the European banks on their loans. They send the sheriff out to the Louisiana plantation and he just turns right back around. So you have to understand in the minds of all these big banks, that's going on in the back of their heads over the decades. And they're looking at it going, we got this whole continent. We're like right there, right? It's just these guys are not paying their debts. They're not on our title system. They don't want to use a national currency. There's all this stuff that's not right in their mind. That's why they're going after it. They got to dislodge these experts, these guys who've been on the land forever, and it required a gigantic war. That is the war, man. Like, that's a war that I've estimated costs 43% of their GDP every year for 4 years. Okay, that
And
war.
for those that aren't familiar with that, the Civil War cost the Union, like in today's currency, like trillions and trillions of dollars. And guess what? They still were getting their ass whooped and had to rely on U.S. colored troops and folks self-emancipating from the South to come win the war for them.
Oh, right. And so a lot of those colored troops are, again, the German Hessians. They pulled 120,000 Germans in with that money. Okay, so again, you have to ask yourself, like, why would they go through all this effort, create the biggest war debt? Like, the amount of debt, guys, is equivalent to, like, if they spent like 5 times what they spent on Iraq over 20 years, only they spent that in 4 years. So you get what I'm trying to say? Like, that's how intense it was. That's worse than World War II is what I'm trying to get. Like, that's more intensity, more death, quicker, in a shorter time, more money spent.
I've been trying to explain to people as if
it was nuts.
To put it in proper context, I tell people this is the true First World War, when these several different European factions came over here to colonize our continent.
Union. Yes, there's all this advice,
and they're occupying us to this day.
Guys, you have Bourbon princes hanging out at the first Union battle on the Union side. Like, what is going on here? This is wild. So again, doesn't it make more sense, even that war, right? And then when you look at the Freedmen's Bank and how they displaced, they took all, so that's how they displaced them after that, right? Oh, we lost your title. Now you got to go through this process. And of course, in the new process, the judge, they have the setup now. Now you got the Methodist judge in there in the new county. And now can't have your you don't count. Like, this is when they begin to really displace the remaining Indians, literally during Reconstruction, and then they're turning them into the sharecroppers, right? And one more thing, because you can find this stuff, guys, Indian Bureau notes, reports, agents wrote notes, okay? Here's one more thing on that. They would go around and see who the good farmers were, and it was always the black guys, right? the freedmen, right? And then they would see who was good, and they'd say, okay, you guys take this land, but you got to start paying taxes in dollars in like 18 months. And then all the white guys are bringing in all these, again, they don't know what they're doing. There's like, you guys get this land and you got 20 years to figure it out. And they'd actually like force, like, so-called freemen get paid to train the white guys how to farm, but they didn't have to ever pay that dollar tax for 20 years. But you're telling me, like, so who are the expert operators and all this? Like, again, they like literally were like, even with all this, they're like getting a hold of land and they're getting it going. And they're like, okay,
well, hold on. For replay value, I try to keep these live streams under the 59-minute mark. Guys, don't worry. As soon as the stream ends, it's going to automatically redirect you into the next one. We're going to do 1 more hour of content so that we can finish out our thoughts and everything. But for the folks who aren't going to be following us to the next broadcast, if you had a message, if you were invited to the proverbial cookout and you can have a message for Native Black Americans, we're putting you on the spot. What you got for us?
Okay, it's called a barbecue, right? Like, what would I be? I would say, man, look into this, look into conversion. Like, really take a look at that when I'm talking about in all these churches, and like, because I'm sure you guys have family history and whatever. So I would really look harder at that, like what really went on there. And I would also just look into the fact that you actually had, if you're in the South, like that slave system, I mean, a lot of you guys were not maybe the plantation masters, but you were part owners. That explains the matriarchs being so powerful. Who were the matriarchs, right? They had right? Like, of course. So things, make a lot more sense. And I would just relook at the Southern slavery narrative. I would point out a book. It's called A Journey Through the Slave Board South, written in the 1850s by an abolitionist who went down there to tell us how horrible slavery was. And it's quite the opposite. Journey Through the Slave Board South. So that's what I would say if I had to give you a few things to think about.
All right. Well, hey, guys, don't worry. When this broadcast ends, it's going to push you to the next one. We're going to have Handsome History up here for a bit longer with us. So don't touch that dial. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. We'll see you in just a moment. All right, guys? No, I'm serious, though. Don't touch that dial. Don't go anywhere. We got another one coming right now. Here we
Many know about slavery, but few discuss paper genocide. We did not all come from Africa, and most of us have Aboriginal roots that were stripped away due to reclassification and miseducation. As a native Black American and a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation, I understand the importance of tracing your lineage. If you want to learn how to trace your genealogy and apply for tribal citizenship, go to nativeblackancestry.com to schedule a consultation.
They don't want you to remember this. You not no slave, you indigenous. Fuck how they painted them Indians. You went to war with the French and the British, man. Quite frankly, you was kings Merovingians. They took the women and men, made them prisoners, raised up the children to worship their images, set up a lab to the genes and they mixed them, and this shit get way deeper than your pigment.